Hey everyone, welcome back to Veterinary Epidemiology. I'm really glad that you're here for this module because this one is a big deal. We're diving into screening programs. Now, if you've worked through the earlier modules on sensitivity, specificity, and predictive values, you already have the foundation you need. What we're going to do in this module is take all of that testing theory and apply it to the real world, to actual population level programs designed to detect disease before animals are even showing signs. Here's what we're going to cover today. First, we'll nail down the critical distinction between screening and diagnosis because it changes the math in ways that surprise a lot of students. Then we'll walk through the Wilson and Jungner criteria, the gold standard framework for deciding whether a disease is even worth screening for. After that, we're going to talk about how prevalence absolutely wrecks your PPV in a screened population and why that matters enormously in practice. We'll compare serial and parallel testing strategies and walk through when you choose each one. And finally, and this is where things get really interesting, we'll expose the sneaky biases that can make a bad screening program look like a great one. Here's the bottom line. The NAVLE and ACVPM boards love screening questions because they don't just test memorization, they test your ability to apply math and judgment at the same time. That's exactly what we're going to build today. Let's get into it. Start with definitions because the difference between screening and diagnosis is more than semantic. It fundamentally changes how you interpret every single test result. Screening is applied to apparently healthy animals in an at-risk population. The animals aren't showing signs. We're going looking for disease that hasn't declared itself yet. Diagnosis, on the other hand, is applied to individual animals that are already showing clinical signs, animals we already have reason to suspect are sick. Why does this distinction matter so much? Because it completely changes your pretest probability, which is just another way of saying prevalence. In a screened, apparently healthy population, prevalence is almost always low. In a diagnostic population, animals already showing signs, prevalence is much higher because you've already selected for likely sick animals. And here's the punchline. Low prevalence devastates your positive predictive value. Even with a very good test, a positive result in a low prevalence screened population has a much higher chance of being a false positive than a positive result in a sick animal you already suspected. Let's make this concrete. Take Johne's disease in dairy cattle. If you're testing every incoming cow at a sale barn, that's screening. Prevalence might be 2 to 5%. Now, take a cow with 6 months of chronic weight loss, diarrhea, and bottle jaw. Testing her is diagnosis. Pretest probability might be 60 to 80%. Same ELISA test, completely different predictive values. Here's an ACVPM exam tip. Screening is for apparently healthy populations. Diagnosis is for animals with clinical signs. This distinction helps you interpret sensitivity, specificity, positive predictive value, and negative predictive value. If an exam question describes a population-wide testing program, assume low prevalence and expect that PPV will be lower than intuition suggests. So we know screening is different from diagnosis, but how do we decide whether a disease is actually worth building a whole screening program around? That's where Wilson and Jungner come in. 1968, Wilson and Jungner wrote a landmark report for the World Health Organization spelling out when a condition is actually worth screening for. Almost 60 years later, this is still the framework your boards expect you to know and apply. The original list ran to 10 points, but they distilled down to the 7 core criteria on the screen. Let's walk through them. One, it has to be an important health problem, common enough or severe enough that catching it early genuinely helps the animal or the herd. Rare low-impact diseases don't justify a population-wide program. Two, there has to be an acceptable treatment or intervention available. If you find disease early but can't do anything about it, there's no point screening in the first place. Three, there has to be a detectable early stage, a latent or pre-symptomatic window where stepping in works better than waiting for clinical signs. If the disease jumps from invisible to fatal overnight, early detection buys you nothing. Four, a suitable test has to exist. Decent sensitivity, low cost, fast, safe, and practical to run across a lot of animals. Five, it has to be acceptable to the population. In our world, that means producers, veterinarians, and the animals themselves. An invasive or stressful test kills compliance fast. Six, the natural history has to be understood. You can't set a sensible screening interval if you don't know how quickly the disease progresses. Seven, it has to be cost effective. The cost of finding and managing early cases has to be justified by the benefit, and that takes a real economic evaluation. Here's how this plays out. Bovine TB checks all 7 boxes, which is exactly why it's the textbook example of a justified screening program. Johne's disease is the cautionary tale. It stumbles on criteria 2 and 7. There's no reliably effective treatment once an animal is infected, and the economics of chasing early cases are genuinely contested. That's why Johne's screening programs stay actively debated. Here's an ACVPM exam tip. Don't just memorize the 7 criteria. Be ready to apply them. If a question describes a disease and asks whether screening is justified, walk the list and find the criterion that fails. For Johne's, the weak links are an effective intervention and cost effectiveness. So we've settled when a disease is worth screening for. Now let's get into the test characteristics you'll use to evaluate and compare tests and see what happens to your predictive values when prevalence is low. Slide that rewires how people think about testing. So let's slow down and work the actual numbers on the screen. We're screening for bovine TB in a low-risk region, 10,000 animals, and the true prevalence is just 1 in 1,000, so 0.1%. That means only 10 of these 10,000 animals actually have TB. Our test is good. Sensitivity is 80%, so it catches 8 of those 10 true cases and misses 2. Specificity is 99%, which sounds excellent, but 99% specificity applied to the 9,990 healthy animals still means we wrongly flag about 1 in 100 of them, and that's 99 false positives. Now, watch what that does to positive predictive value. We have 107 animals testing positive, but only 8 of them truly have TB. The other 99 are false alarms. PPV is 8 divided by 107, which comes out to just 7.5%. Let that land. A positive result on this test is wrong more than 9 times out of 10, even though the test itself is genuinely good. Negative predictive value is the mirror image. Of the 9,893 animals that test negative, 9,891 are truly clean. NPV is 99.98%, so a negative result here is rock solid. If this test clears an animal, you can believe it. Here's the screening paradox in one sentence. When prevalence is very low, even a high specificity test generates far more false positives than true positives. The math isn't broken and the test isn't bad, it's the low prevalence doing the damage. And that's exactly why a positive screen can never be the end of the story. You confirm before you act. Here's an ACVPM tip. Know the 2x2 table cold and be ready to compute sensitivity, specificity, positive predictive value, and negative predictive value straight from the cells. In screening scenarios, PPV is almost always lower than your gut says because prevalence is low. When a question hands you a quote surprising number of false positives, that's the prevalence effect. Name it. So, a single test in a low prevalence population leaves us drowning in false positives. What do we do about it? We test in stages. Let's see how a two-stage TB program turns that 7.5% into something you can actually act on. Fix for that false positive problem. Don't rely on one test. Run them in sequence. This is serial two-stage screening, and the Bovine TB program is the classic example. Watch how it rescues that ugly 7.5% PPV from the last slide. Stage 1 is the population screen. We use the caudal fold tuberculin test, cheap, fast, and highly sensitive. Exactly what you want when you're running thousands of animals and your top priority is not missing a true case. We accept that it throws off a lot of false positive. For now, that's fine. Animals that test negative at stage 1 are cleared. They're very unlikely to have TB. Remember, NPV is about 99.98%, so they're released from restriction with no further testing. We only carry the positives forward. And here's the beautiful part. Prevalence enrichment. Those 107 reactor animals are no longer a low prevalence group. 8 of them truly have TB, so within this screened positive pool, prevalence has jumped from 0.1% all the way up to 7.5%. We've concentrated the disease into a much smaller, much richer group. Now, stage 2 makes sense. We run the comparative cervical tuberculin test, the CCT, which has higher specificity on that enriched group. Because we're now testing in a higher prevalence population, PPV climbs from 7.5% up to roughly 70 to 80%. Confirmed positives can then be managed with real confidence. Quarantine, depopulation, and indemnification at fair market value. That's serial testing in a nutshell. A sensitive screen first, a specific confirmation second, which drives up specificity and positive predictive value. The flip side is parallel testing, where you run 2 tests at once and call an animal positive on either one. That boosts sensitivity and NPV, and you reach for it when missing a case is catastrophic. Think border security or disease-free certification. Here's an ACVPM exam tip. Serial testing increases specificity and PPV. Parallel testing increases sensitivity and NPV. These are among the most heavily tested ideas in diagnostic epidemiology. When a question combines 2 tests, immediately ask whether the scenario needs high confidence in a positive, serial, or maximum case detection, parallel. Two-stage testing cleans up our false positives, but a subtler trap is waiting. Even a well-run program can look more successful than it really is. Let's expose the 2 biases that fool people into overestimating screening. Which test to use isn't enough. You also have to know how screening can deceive you. 2 biases can make a completely useless program look like a triumph. Let's take them one at a time. First, lead time bias. Advancing the clock isn't the same as extending life. Screening detects disease earlier than clinical signs would, so animals in the screen group appear to survive longer after diagnosis. Their survival curves look better, and the program looks like a win. But here's the trap. We haven't changed the outcome at all. The animal still dies at the same age and the disease still progresses at the same rate. All we did was start the clock earlier. Picture two cows, both destined to die of Johne's at age 7. Cow A is caught by ELISA at age 4 and, quote, survives 3 years after diagnosis. Cow B isn't diagnosed until she shows signs at age 6 and, quote, survives 1 year. Both die at 7. Screening didn't add a single day. It just gave us 3 extra years of knowing. That illusion of longer survival is lead time bias. Second, length biased sampling. Screening catches the easy cases first. Periodic screening doesn't catch a random sample of cases. It preferentially catches the slow ones. Fast, aggressive cases race to clinical signs and show up as emergencies between screening rounds, so the screen never sees them. The slow, indolent cases sit in that preclinical window long enough to get picked up. The result is that screen-detected animals look like they do better, but partly because the screen was scooping up the mild cases that were going to do well anyway. You're comparing two groups that were never the same to begin with. Both biases inflate the apparent benefit of screening without improving a single real outcome. The only design that cuts through both is a randomized controlled trial that compares screened versus unscreened populations and uses mortality, not earlier diagnosis, as the endpoint. Here's an ACVPM exam tip. Lead time bias makes screening look like it improves survival when all it did was move the diagnosis date earlier. Control for it by measuring survival from a fixed biological point like infection or birth, not from diagnosis. Length bias means the screen overrepresents slow progressing disease. If a question shows better post-diagnosis survival with no real drop in mortality, the answer is lead time bias. So, how do we tell a genuinely effective program from one that just looks good on paper? We measure it properly. Let's get into the framework for evaluating whether a screening program actually works. Running a screening program is one thing. Proving it works is another. This framework sorts your evaluation into 4 buckets, moving from are we doing the work all the way to is it worth the money? Let's walk left to right. First, process measures, the operational metrics. Coverage. What proportion of the target population did we actually test? Compliance. Did the screen positive animals come back for confirmatory testing? And turnaround. How fast did a positive result become a management decision? A flawless test applied to 20% of herds still has limited impact. Second, intermediate outcomes, detection quality. What's our detection rate, cases found per animal screened? Are we catching disease at an earlier stage? And are we monitoring PPV so we're not drowning in false positives? These tell you the screen is doing its job before the population level effects show up. Third, final outcomes. Population health impact, and this is what we actually care about. Is disease incidence trending down over time? Is herd level prevalence falling? Are disease-related mortality and morbidity dropping? And for regulated diseases, are we holding on to the trade status and disease freedom certifications that carry real economic weight? Fourth, economic evaluation. Cost per case detected, cost per case prevented. The cost-benefit ratio of running the program versus not, and how it stacks up against alternative control strategies. A program that works biologically but bankrupts producers won't survive. One metric we're singling out is number needed to screen, NNS. It's 1 divided by the difference in benefit rate between screened and unscreened animals, and it answers a very practical question. How many animals must we screen to prevent one bad outcome? If the NNS is 500 and each screen costs $10, you're spending about $5,000 per event prevented. That's the number that lets you compare screening against anything else you could do without money. Enough theory. let's see these ideas in the wild. Next up, for real veterinary screening programs that span the whole spectrum from outright triumph to ongoing struggle. Let's ground everything we've covered in 4 real programs. Lined up side by side, they show you the full spectrum of screening outcomes, from near total success to ongoing frustration. And the common thread is whether the test was a good match for the job. Bovine TB in the US and UK, our near eradication story running since 1917. It screens with the caudal fold tuberculin test, confirms with a comparative cervical test, and clears infected animals with test and slaughter. It got us to near eradication by the 1990s, and then hit setbacks from wildlife reservoirs, badgers in the UK, white-tailed deer in the US. The lesson: a domestic program can be undone by a reservoir it can't test. Brucellosis, the U.S. eradication effort. It screens with the Brucella milk ring test, then confirms with serum agglutination and the BPAT, all sitting on top of a herd accreditation system. Combining test and slaughter with vaccination has driven brucellosis nearly out of cattle. But same story as TB. A stubborn wildlife reservoir persists in bison and elk around Yellowstone. Johne's disease, the USDA program launched in 2003, and our limited efficacy example. It's voluntary, ELISA-based herd screening. The problem is the test. Individual animal sensitivity is only 15 to 30% in subclinical animals, so it misses early infected cattle for years. The workaround is to test multiple animals per herd and classify at the herd level, but voluntary uptake keeps coverage low. And equine infectious anemia, the Coggins test, our classic success. It uses the agar gel immunodiffusion, that AGID test, and it's required for interstate movement, import, and competition. By keeping positive horses out of circulation, it quietly prevented spread through iatrogenic transmission and contaminated blood products for decades. Put them together and the takeaway is simple. The test has to match the epidemiological demand of the decision you're making. When it does, TB, brucellosis, EIA, you get control or eradication. When it doesn't, like Johne's, poor early stage sensitivity, even a well-intentioned program stalls. These programs work best when you point them at the right animals. So let's talk about risk-based screening, how to raise your odds before the sample even reaches the lab. It's one of the most powerful and underappreciated ideas in screening. If you can't make your tests better, make your population better. Risk-based screening means pointing the same test at the animals most likely to be infected, and the math rewards you for it. Start with the core idea. PPV depends on prevalence, and prevalence isn't fixed. It depends on which animals you choose to test. Bayes' formula spells it out. PPV equals sensitivity times prevalence over that same term plus the false positive contribution. The single biggest lever you can actually pull is the prevalence in the group you screen. Raise the working prevalence and PPV climbs automatically. Same test, better performance, different population. So where do you find higher prevalence? You target it. Screen imported animals more intensively. They carry unknown histories. Prioritize herds with epidemiological risk factors, a wildlife interface, an infected premises next door, or animals sourced from high prevalence regions. You're deliberately enriching the pool before you ever run the test. You can formalize that geographically with stratified, zone-based programs. The U.S. Bovine TB program is the model. States with active TB actively get tested every 6 to 12 months. Modified accredited advanced areas test annually, and fully TB accredited low-risk areas only every 3 years. Intense surveillance where the risk is, a lighter touch where it isn't. That's how you spend limited testing dollars well. And you can Target in time, not just space. Screen at the highest risk moments, when an animal enters a new herd or facility, during peak production stress, and right after commingling events like shows, sales, and transport. Those are the windows when introduction and transmission are most likely. The principle to carry out of this slide: if you can't improve the test, improve the population you apply it to. Risk-based targeting raises your working prevalence, and PPV improves all by itself. We've been talking about classifying individual animals, but sometimes the real question isn't, is this cow infected? It's, is this herd infected? That changes the math, so let's look at herd level versus animal level screening. Now we've been asking, is this animal infected? But a huge amount of veterinary screening asks a different question entirely. Is this herd infected? Those are two different goals, and they come with two different sets of math. Individual level screening classifies each animal as positive or negative, and you judge it on animal level sensitivity and specificity. The catch is that for some diseases, that sensitivity is brutal. Take Johne's. A single ELISA for MAP has only 15 to 30% sensitivity in subclinical animals. Test one cow, and you'll miss most early infections. As a tool for clearing an individual animal, it's weak. Herd level screening flips the question. You're not trying to nail down every animal, you just want to know whether at least one infected animal exists in the herd. The strategy is to test several animals and call the whole herd positive if any one of them tests positive, and that simple change rescues a weak test. Here's why. The herd sensitivity formula on the screen. Herd sensitivity equals 1 minus, in parentheses, 1 minus the individual sensitivity raised to the n, where n is the number of animals you test. Plug in that miserable 30% sensitivity. Test one animal and herd sensitivity is just 30%. Test 3 and it's about 66%. Test 5, 83%. Test 10 animals and you're at 97%. Test 15 and you're over 99%. A test that misses 2 out of 3 individual animals can still flag an infected herd almost every time. So the headline is that testing more animals per herd compensates for low individual sensitivity, but only up to a point, and only if there's truly an infected animal in there to find. The practical lesson for program design: you don't just specify the test, you specify how many animals to test per herd, and you justify that number with the herd sensitivity formula. Here's an ACVPM exam tip. Don't confuse animal level sensitivity with herd sensitivity. Memorize HSE equals 1 minus SE to the n, and be ready to plug in numbers. The classic result: 30% individual sensitivity across 10 tested animals gives roughly 97% herd sensitivity. Boards love this one for Johne's. But even a perfectly designed test strategy runs into something no formula can solve: people. Screening is ultimately a policy decision, so let's talk ethics, incentives, and compliance. A truth the formulas never tell you. A screening program lives or dies on human behavior. You can have the perfect test and the perfect interval and still watch the whole thing collapse because the incentives are wrong. Screening is a policy decision, not just a test decision. 4 issues sit at the center of it. First, informed consent and producer autonomy. Mandatory programs get you high coverage, but they require legal authority and they override choice. Voluntary programs respect autonomy, but they suffer from participation bias. The healthy herds are happy to enroll, while the problem herds quietly opt out. So the very animals you most need to find are the ones least likely to show up, and your disease picture gets skewed. Second, fair compensation. Any test and slaughter program depends on fair indemnification. If you ask a producer to destroy animals and don't pay them fairly, They won't comply. They'll hide disease instead, and that destroys the surveillance system from the inside. The U.S. Bovine TB program gets this right by indemnifying at fair market value, which lines the producer's interest up with the public health goal. Third, equity and the disproportionate burden. Mandatory testing lands much harder on small and resource-limited producers. Testing costs, movement restrictions, and depopulation losses that a large operation can absorb can wipe out a small one. If you don't build support and equity into the program's architecture on purpose, you punish the people least able to bear it. And fourth, stigma and perverse incentives. A herd that tests positive can face market stigma, distrust from neighbors, and even media attention, consequences well beyond the regulatory ones. If being honest gets you punished, people stop being honest. Good program design fights that with confidentiality protections and neutral, non-blaming language, so producers stay engaged. The principle that ties it all together. Epidemiological success is inseparable from economic fairness. Inadequate compensation, unmanaged stigma, and inequitable burden, any one of them quietly destroys compliance. And without compliance, the whole surveillance system falls apart. We've covered the science, the math, and the politics. Let's put it all into one practical checklist you can use to design a screening program from the ground up. Everything in this module into something you can actually use. An 8-step checklist for building a screening program from scratch. And pay attention to where it starts, because the order matters enormously. Step 1, apply the Wilson and Jungner criteria. Before anything else, ask whether this disease even deserves a screening program. Does it meet all 7 criteria? If it doesn't, you'd better be able to justify the exceptions. Step 2, define the target population. Which animals, which production types, which geographic area. Lean toward risk-based targeting. Remember, the population you choose drives your prevalence, and prevalence drives PPV. Step 3, select the test. Weigh sensitivity, specificity, cost, practical applicability, and regulatory acceptance. The most accurate test in the world is useless if no regional lab can run it. Step 4, define the test protocol. Individual or herd level. How many animals per herd? And do you need a 2-stage design to clean up false positives? This is where the herd sensitivity math earns its keep. Step 5, set your action thresholds in advance. What counts as a screen positive? What confirmatory test follows? And what does a confirmed positive actually trigger? Quarantine, culling, treatment? Decide all of this before you start. Step 6, design the feedback systems. How do results reach practitioners and producers? What reports get generated and who gets the alerts? A result nobody acts on is a wasted test. Step 7, plan for evaluation from day 1. Coverage tracking, PPV monitoring, disease trend tracking, and cost per case analysis. Build the measurement in before you launch, not after. And step 8, which is never optional, address incentives and ethics, indemnification, confidentiality, producer support, and equity across operations of every size. This is the piece that keeps people participating. Here's the thing to remember about this whole list. It does not start with the test. It starts with the disease and the criteria. Test selection only comes after screening is justified and the goals are defined. Programs designed backward, test first, program second, fail because the test never matches the real epidemiological demand. All right, let's bring it all home with the exam essentials, the handful of ideas you absolutely have to walk into the test knowing cold. Let's pull it all together. We covered a lot of ground, and I want you walking out with the framework, not just a pile of facts. Here are your essentials. Screening is not Diagnosis. Screening targets apparently healthy, at-risk populations and prioritizes sensitivity. Diagnosis targets animals already showing clinical signs and prioritizes specificity. Same test, completely different performance because prevalence is low in the screened group, and that's the whole game. The screening paradox. Low prevalence plus high sensitivity still gives you low PPV. Always set up a 2x2 table on 10,000 animals to confirm your math. You beat the paradox two ways. Two-stage screening. Screen, then confirm. And risk-based targeting that enriches the population you test. Wilson and Jungner, the 7 criteria. These justify any screening program. An important problem, an effective intervention, a detectable early stage, a suitable test, acceptability, an understood natural history, and cost effectiveness. Know all 7 and be ready to apply them to Johne's, BVD, and Brucellosis, not just recite them. Serial versus parallel and the biases. Serial testing raises specificity and PPV. Parallel testing raises sensitivity and NPV. And stay alert to lead time and length bias. Both make a program look better than it is. Only a randomized trial with a mortality endpoint truly proves screening works. Herd sensitivity. HSE equals 1 minus 1 minus SE to the N. Testing more animals compensates for poor individual sensitivity. 10 animals at 30% sensitivity each gets you to about 97% at the herd level. One last strategy for exam day. Every time you hit a screening question, ask yourself three things. What's the prevalence in this population? What's the purpose of this test? To find every case or to confirm a positive? And which biases might be in play here? Screening questions reward the candidate who reasons through the logic, not the one who just memorized formulas. And honestly, you've got this. These concepts are completely learnable, and the fact that you're working through them now is exactly the applied reasoning the boards are built to test. Looking ahead, the next module moves into genetic epidemiology, heritability, GWAS, and population genetics. It ties directly back to what we said about overdiagnosis and carrier testing. So it's a natural next step. Make sure you're subscribed so you don't miss it, and share it with your study group. Thanks so much for watching. I'll see you in the next one. Final checklist for the ACVPM exam tips. Screening equals healthy at-risk population. Diagnosis equals clinical signs present. PPV falls as prevalence falls. Always run the 2x2 table. Serial testing increases specificity, increases positive predictive value. Parallel testing increases sensitivity, increases negative predictive value. Lead time bias equals earlier detection, not longer survival. Length bias is screening catches slow progressing cases preferentially. Overdiagnosis equals detection of disease that would never have caused harm. No Johne's, BVD PI, and Brucellosis MRT programs cold. Wilson and Jungner, all 7 criteria apply, don't just list. Thanks, and see you next time.